Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tom Summer. I'm president of MassMEDIC, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. We have a program on systems engineering for medical device development that has been put together by our friends at Sunrise Labs in Bedford, New Hampshire. It's my pleasure to introduce Nick Lesnowski-Las, or Nick Double L, as he is known at Sunrise Labs. Nick is an accomplished product designer in the fields of medical devices, robotics, wearables, microfluidics, and semiconductor manufacturing tools. He was one of the first members of the advanced technology team at the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering at Harvard University. Before he joined Wyss, he developed robotics and metrology equipment for semiconductor and manufacturing tools, and he helped to build the reliability department at Varian Semiconductor. He is a graduate, Bachelor of Science in Electrical and Systems Engineering from RPI in New York. So welcome, Nick, and look forward to your comments this afternoon.
Thanks, Tom. So today we're going to be talking, as Tom said, about systems engineering for medical device development. So why are we talking about this today? So the reason is that across all industries, really, not just medical devices, devices are getting more complex because users are expecting more functionality. They're expecting better user interfaces, particularly through web services and through their mobile devices, which means that our devices, our medical devices, need to have a higher level of integration with their device ecosystem. So a lot of times people talk about IoT, the Internet of Things, but it's more than just the Internet. There's all kinds of user interactions that were previously unimaginable 10 years ago until technology really caught up with highly integrated sensors and low-power communications protocols like Bluetooth Low Energy. The example shown above here is an inhaler example, and I think this is a great example of a device that used to be, for 60 years, this extremely simple, well, not that simple, but fairly simple mechanical device that people, you press down the canister and you deliver some drug. But nowadays, companies are adding tons of intelligence and connectivity into these things to add functionality such as device tracking so that the user doesn't lose their inhaler, which is a big problem with inhalers, as well as sensors to sense the position and the motion of the canister so that you can provide use metrics to the user and reinforce good use practices. This is extremely important to inhalers because studies have shown that upwards of half of users use their inhalers incorrectly. So there's even some manufacturers that are looking into adding actuators into their inhalers to take that control out of the user's hands and ensure that the drug is delivered properly. All of this is an extraordinary amount of additional componentry and intelligence, and combines software and electrical and mechanical and human factors, usability engineering, into what was previously a fairly simple mechanical device. And the interactions between those different engineering disciplines and the different outputs of the mechanical and software and electrical engineers needs to be managed. And the way that that's coordinated is we bring in systems engineering. We bring in systems engineering to help deal with the interfaces particularly, as well as the high-level vision of the product, and to guide the electrical and mechanical engineers towards producing a consistent device, a consistent image. So what is systems engineering? So throughout this presentation, I will talk about the role of a systems engineer. I will touch upon the benefits of implementing a systems engineering process and try to bring back a lot of the points to those benefits. And then I'll give an overview of part of a systems engineering process. I can't go into absolutely everything because there are undergraduate and graduate degree programs in this field, and I obviously can't cover all of that in a 45-minute, 35-minute webinar here. So the role of a systems engineer. I have a lot to say about the role of a systems engineer. I'll try to keep it not too long. So systems engineering is obviously a hot topic right now in the medical devices field, but I think there's a lack of understanding about what that really means, about what a systems engineer does. I hear this a lot. I see this in white papers. I see this in talks at shows. A lot of people say if you ask 5 different people what a systems engineer does, you'll get 5 different answers. For example, systems engineers may be test engineers. They may be design engineers. Someone may come from that approach. I think this is okay, and I want to get that point across to people. This is the same situation you have with pretty much any engineering discipline. If you ask 5 different people what an electrical engineer does, you'll get 5 different answers there as well. They may be an electrical test engineer. They may be a design engineer. They may be the person designing the next Intel processor, or they may be the person designing a guidance system for a rocket. Now, there's all kinds of tasks that the engineers do, and the fact that different people have different ideas of what those are simply talks to the background of the people who are giving that opinion. I think the important thing to keep in mind is not so much what do systems engineers do in general, it's what do systems engineers do for me, for my project, and how can I fit that into or use that to benefit my project. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be speaking specifically about systems design engineering because my background is primarily in design engineering, and Sunrise is a design engineering company, so it makes sense that that's my role and my experience. In this case, a systems design engineer would be someone who works alongside the mechanical, the electrical, and the software design engineers while designing the medical devices. They work alongside them to coordinate the interactions of their efforts. They are responsible for the interfaces between the other disciplines, and I like to say that they're responsible for the product vision. What I mean by that is there are different stakeholders and different people involved in producing and using a product. You have management and executives who have certain ideas about what the output of a design process will be, what the device will look like. You have customers who have certain user needs. And then you have engineers in the engineering team who have their own take on what the device does based on whether or not they're designing the electronics or they're designing the mechanics. And the systems engineer's role, one of the systems engineer's roles, is to make sure that those visions all align towards a common product vision so that the engineering team produces something that the executives are expecting to see and that ultimately the users want to use. If there's misalignment in this, then you have problems because then what the design engineering team produces doesn't meet the needs of the user or doesn't meet the expectations, the business expectations of the company. And that can be a huge problem. It can waste a ton of money because you have to go back and redesign it. Or it can result in a product that gets released that users don't want to use, and ultimately they move to a competitor's product instead of your own, which would be a disaster. So at Sunrise, systems engineers are generally design engineers who are expected to have both great depth in some technical fields as well as breadth across many technical fields. For example, I have depth in electrical and software engineering, but I've also done pneumatics design, robotics, a number of electromechanical systems, and hydraulics as well. Depending on the size of the project, a project may have multiple systems engineers, may have a dedicated systems engineer, or may have a part-time systems engineer, or the project manager may double as a systems engineer, or a design engineer could double as a systems engineer. That is, all of those modalities are possible. At Sunrise, a lot of the project managers specifically have strong systems engineering backgrounds, and so oftentimes the project manager will also double as a systems engineer, which leads me to the little bullet at the bottom of this slide, which is that I want to make it clear that I think that project management and systems engineering are not only not the same, but I don't think that systems engineering is a subset of project management, which I think is implied by, and sometimes outright said, by people in other white papers and in talks I've heard. I think that systems engineers often make good project managers, but I think that the skills that make a good project manager are not necessarily the skills that will make them a good systems engineer, and to some extent vice versa. I think it's important to make that distinction because I think often the two get conflated because particularly with smaller projects, project managers often take on a lot of the roles of the systems engineer, particularly this product vision role that I discussed earlier. That may happen, but I would say that that's a project manager doing a systems engineering task rather than doing a project management task. And the important distinction there is that that task can then be offloaded to a systems engineer if, for example, there's too much work for one person to do. So I think it's important to make that distinction, and also I think it's important to understand that systems engineering is a form of engineering. It is not a form of management. And the systems engineers are really more aligned with electrical engineers and mechanical engineers than with project managers. I like to say that an ideal systems engineer, who of course doesn't exist, could be a drop-in replacement for any other engineer on the team. Obviously, that's impossible. No one has enough depth in every field to do that, but that's my way of saying that I think systems engineering is more aligned with the goals and responsibilities of engineers than of management. So, benefits of implementing systems engineering processes. So, I think probably if you're attending this webinar, you already believe that there are benefits to implementing systems engineering processes. I think the bullet points describe a number of them. I would say something that I hear a lot is that the FDA is increasingly expecting to see that companies follow systems engineering processes and show artifacts of following systems engineering processes, which is a great reason for management to push for it. I would argue that that's not a great reason for design engineers to push for it, because I think regulations and regulatory bodies like the FDA create regulations in order to encourage companies and require companies to conform to some minimum set of best design practices. I think as a design engineer, I would like to always conform to best design practices and design my devices as best as possible. And I believe that establishing processes, engineering processes, in this case, a systems engineering process, helps to improve consistency of your process outputs, of your designs. I would also add that if your products have any complexity at all, then you are already doing systems engineering. You may not recognize it as such, you may not call it as such, and you may not have a process for controlling it, but you are doing it. And as such, it would benefit you to identify those tasks and to create a process around them so that you don't have, for example, the project manager doing some of those tasks and the electrical engineer doing others of those tasks and the mechanical engineer doing others of those tasks, all coming at it from different viewpoints. It's important to have consistency in the application of systems engineering or any other engineering. And so by creating a process around it and assigning roles around it, you can improve that consistency and have a better outcome. So here I have a diagram of a systems engineering process. There's no one process. There's no required process. This process diagram follows a basic design engineering process flow where you have inputs, outputs, and then some design tasks and design efforts in the middle. For systems engineering, here we show two different parallel but not necessarily related design efforts that are both the responsibility of systems engineers. The outer loop refers to what I would call the systems architecture processes, where the systems engineer is responsible for the high-level view of the project, taking the high-level view of the project, determining the functions that are there, allocating them to subunits, which may be subsystems or components, and then further iterating down and defining those subsystems in terms of their requirements, analyzing their functions, allocating them to specific sub-blocks of that subsystem, and so on until you reach the component level of all of your subsystems. And the components are designs that can be allocated to engineers within a single discipline. So when I say components, sometimes electrical engineers, for example, might think of electrical components as components. From a systems level, a component is an element of the system that fits more or less entirely within one engineering discipline so that it can be designed by the team of that discipline, so a mechanical engineering task or an electrical engineering task. In that case, a custom PCB might be a component at the system level, not the components of the PCB. The inner part there, the circle, is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this presentation. I think there are already a lot of presentations and white papers about systems architecture and those processes and how to come up with a functional block diagram, a functional flow block diagram, and a physical block diagram, and how to trace those. So I'm going to talk more about the inner part, which I think gets less attention, which are sort of discrete tasks that systems engineers do throughout the design process that are not necessarily architecture related, but are still critical to the design process. So first I'm going to talk about a couple of analysis tasks. In this case, trade-off analysis, which is often also referred to as trade studies, though I prefer the term trade-off analysis, and effectiveness analysis or effectivity analysis, which is very similar. So for trade-off analysis, I want to be very specific and not just give a general idea. I think people who haven't done trade-off analyses and who may be not sure about what's involved may or will frequently overestimate what I mean when I say a trade-off analysis. A trade-off analysis is a semi-quantitative and semi-qualitative comparison of different design options. This can be done at various points in the design process, usually early on enough such that you haven't actually gone through physical prototyping and extensive testing of the system, because you are trying to find options that give you the best bet of success. Usually the artifact of this is exactly what I show up here, or a larger version of what I show up here, which is a matrix that has rows of different options to implement and columns of different characteristics about those options that you want to characterize and weigh against each other. So in this case, the example I use is for a robot servo drive. This is more or less exactly what I'd expect from an output of a trade-off analysis if I asked an engineer to do a trade-off analysis, with the exception that I would expect a little bit more in the description section. But the basic gist is you have an option of doing a custom design, or you can take something off the shelf. There are a ton of manufacturers of servo drives out there, Elmo, Copley, and Galil being just 3 options. And these options were investigated from the standpoint of the size, efficiency, power, design cost, product cost, and schedule impact. The top row is the weighting of all of those. So in this case, we're saying size is not very important. And we're saying that schedule impact is the most important thing. This is, for a robot servo drive, fairly likely, because in any device design process, schedule is enormously important. And for a robot servo drive, you can probably put it across the room in a cabinet. The size is not a very big challenge. So as you can see here, we've assigned values from 1 to 5, where 1 implies the worst option or the least desirable, and 5 is the best. So for the custom design, for example, that gets a 5 for size because you can make it more or less any size you want. You can make it fit your profile very well. That's great, but size isn't that important, so we give it a weighting of 1. And so the way we calculate the total is we multiply the weighting by the point value for the option, and we add all of those up across the row. So for example, size only adds in 5 total points to the custom design's output, total, despite the fact that it's great, it's not that important to the project. Whereas schedule impact, it also only adds 5, because the schedule impact of designing your own servo drive is enormous compared to using an off-the-shelf drive. In particular, the Copley was already familiar with the team, so it was the best from a schedule standpoint because the team had less learning to do. So that one added 25 points for the Copley to the total, where only 5 were added to the custom design. As you can see from the totals, it's fairly clear that although the custom design is probably technically best in terms of the performance features, it is actually the worst choice to go ahead with, and I would not recommend doing that until evidence was found to change this way. Based on this design, the Elmo and Copley come out very close and at the top end. So when options come out very close like that, you have 2 options for going forward. You can either try to find ways of differentiating them further at this point in the analysis, or you can pursue them in parallel and hope that they differentiate during the design process and during the implementation process. The important part, or one of the important parts about a trade-off analysis, is to do it early enough that you do it before wasting a lot of time and money pursuing options or pursuing design solutions that are suboptimal. You can immediately rule out options based on this analysis before you ever get to prototyping. It's a good way of de-risking the design process. The best practice point down at the bottom is also a good point where you can, I've seen numbers from 1 to 3 and 1 to 5. In some cases, I've seen 1 to 10. I recommend using whole numbers from 1 to 5 or 1 to 3, and definitely stick to whole numbers. As with other processes like FMEA and hazard analysis, people will tend in a meeting to try and throw in a 0.5 or a 0.75 to differentiate and say, well, the Copley is only slightly better, so we're not going to call it a 5, we'll call it a 4.5. It's not worth it. If you're getting down to that level of detail, then you're doing a little too much for an initial trade-off analysis. So the next point is about effectiveness analysis, which is basically the same. I'm not going to say the same. It's similar or related to a trade-off analysis, with the major difference being that you're using measured outcomes of actual implementations. So oftentimes this refers to what's done with user studies, where you show that your design choices in your ultimate design, or one of your design options, has a certain performance relative to the expected performance with the user, or in a certain effectiveness. And this effectiveness can be defined in lots of different ways. So you have cost effectiveness, you have usability is another one. And in general, it's a similar sort of process where you could make a matrix. If you have different options that you pursued, you can show how effective they were and judge which option is the best from an effectiveness standpoint. An important point to note here, as mentioned in the best practices, is that you really want to decide how you're going to measure and analyze effectiveness before you actually do this analysis. That's true of most processes, but it's very easy to, since effectiveness analysis is an after-the-fact sort of thing, it's a post-hoc analysis, you can analyze things in 1,000 different ways, analyze results in 1,000 different ways, and come up with 1,000 different results. It's important to make sure you know what your targets are ahead of time. That helps you design towards them, it helps you measure them, and it helps you come to decisions and avoid having 10 different stakeholders decide that the results mean 10 different things. So the next set of things I'm going to talk about, we usually call controls or system controls. So there's system simulation and modeling, TPM or technical performance measurement, margin analysis or margin design, traceability, reviews, and configuration management. So system simulation and modeling is near and dear to my heart, as I have a background in controls engineering and electrical engineering, and simulation and modeling are critical to both. For system simulation and modeling, the processes are basically the same as for anything else, except the intent or the expectation for systems is that you're trying to model things that are beyond the scope or outside the scope of just one engineering discipline. So for example, up on the screen, you have a simplified model of a robot servo drive, or a robot axis of motion actually is more accurate. And I say simplified, but this is actually a sufficient model, assuming that you have the actual equations that determine the interactions between these things defined to answer some important questions. And that's really the point of simulation and modeling. The idea is that you want to answer hopefully very specific questions about the operation of your system. So for example, I might use this model to do some performance simulations to affect, say, to measure, for example, the effect of the load mass on system power efficiency. Load mass will change how much torque the motor has to apply, which will change the current requirements of the servo drive, which might change the power supply requirements, which might change the efficiency of all of those, the efficiency point of all of those components. If I understand my load well, and I understand the interaction of the load and gravity of the load on the motor torque, and then the motor torque on the servo drive characteristics, I can determine whether my motor is oversized or undersized, or whether I'm operating within an efficient point, or even if the model is good enough, what the expected efficiency of the system is. This helps to really de-risk some important features. For example, with this design, and we did something very similar to this, you can de-risk the motor design. If you're designing a custom motor, there may be a 14-week lead time between any iterations of the motor, and the most efficient operating point of a high torque motor can be very, very narrow. And so if you misdesign it, you may end up throwing your efficiency off by an enormous amount, from 90% to 60%, which could make, for example, with a battery-powered device, make all the difference and cut your battery power by 30% or 40%, which could turn a product from a viable product into a non-viable product. So it's very important to try to understand those factors before you go into the design, because it can save you enormous amounts of time, 14 weeks in this case. There are many other questions you could ask with the same model if you apply it in slightly different ways. You could ask about, you could ask something as specific as how the armature length impacts the power supply voltage, or how the current limits on the armature, on the servo drive, restrict the armature's range of motion based on the torque required to drive the load. There's lots of things you can answer as long as your model is good. So what makes a model good? Well, it has to be specifically designed to answer specific questions. It has to be designed by someone who understands the interaction between the different modules, between the different sub-modules. So you have to have someone who understands how the motor's winding characteristics affect the current requirements of the servo drive, if that's a question you want to answer. And you have to have tools that help to solve these problems. It's very difficult to solve these things with pen and paper. Tools is an interesting topic that can get a little too deep, so I won't go into great detail, but I think just saying tools doesn't answer a lot of questions for people. When I say tools, I mean there are specific simulation frameworks out there like MATLAB's Simulink or Modelica, which is one I use frequently and highly recommend looking into. But I would also say that the vast majority of system models that I've designed are done in Excel, or more recently in Google Sheets, which I particularly like because then you can collaboratively design the models with your engineers. A lot of system simulations don't deal with actual performance metrics like this. Oftentimes you will simulate things like the total weight of the system by plugging in different allocations for different modules, and that can help you to set limits on your design engineers to design the components within certain limits. There's all kinds of things all kinds of questions you can answer with simulation and modeling. It's really up to your systems engineers to figure out what are the important ones to answer. A common error I see is people trying to answer everything, or rather not knowing what they're trying to answer and trying to model the system to the nth degree and get every interaction with every part and hope that useful information falls out of it. That's never how that works. You really need to understand what you're trying to answer and design the simplest model possible to answer that question with as much accuracy as you feel is necessary at the time of design. And what is necessary at the time of design will change based on whether you're modeling very early in the design or you're modeling later in the design. Later in the design, you'll hopefully have verified that your models are at least close to accurate and tune them based on actual prototype results and measurements from your first builds. And then you can improve your models and see how to tune them to maximize performance or minimize cost, things like that. Okay, so next slide. Technical performance measurements. So technical performance measurements, or TPM, is a process of tracking technical performance throughout the design process of a product. So in this case, this is what I would expect as an output if I asked someone to show me what the TPM for battery life is a few months into a product design. As you see at the beginning, you can follow performance even through simulation. So in the beginning, we may have created a simulation that told us we'd get 18 hours of battery life out of this thing. And then we tweaked the device or the system through simulation and got to where we thought we'd end up with 28 hours of battery life through a couple of iterations of simulation. Then we built the first prototype, the first benchtop prototype, and found that we missed our target by quite a bit. We're at 22 hours. And then this shows the progression of actually decreasing at some point as we determined that we need to change the design in certain ways that had a negative impact on battery life. And then because we weren't meeting our targets, we put a concerted effort in to optimize the efficiency of the system and got our battery life up. Oftentimes, what's not shown here is I will put a line or a set of regions on there that show what our target zones are. So there might be a green zone at the top that says if we're in this zone, we're doing great. And there might be a zone above that that says we've got way more than we need, which will never intentionally decrease performance unless we can do so to trade off something like cost. So that could be another cost savings thing. If it turns out that your battery life is 100 hours and you only need 30, well, then you might be able to save cost on the battery by using a battery that's half the size. The best practice note here is, again, in my opinion, a very important one. Just because a performance metric can be tracked doesn't mean it should be. I see that a lot of people will say, well, what's the TPM on, for example, with the servo drive one, what's the TPM on the size? Well, it doesn't matter. No one cared about size. It wasn't important to the project. So you're wasting time trying to track that. And not just wasting time, you're giving information that may lead people to engage in design efforts that are not worthwhile, which is a waste of design cost and a schedule impact, right? So if you're trying to optimize the size and no one cares about size, that's a waste. So the next slide talks about design margin analysis, which is somewhat similar to TPM, except that with performance measurements, you're usually looking at how that's evolving over time. Margin analysis, you may look at how it's evolving over time, but usually you're taking snapshots like shown here. Basically, what we're showing here is that there is some requirement or set of requirements that require the device to operate within that region, from 11 to 21 degrees and 600 to 1,000 torr. We have different design options that in this case are represented by component ovals. And the idea is that those components or those design options will give us performance in those ranges. And comparing those ranges to our required performance envelope plus some margin will tell us how close we are to meeting our requirements. Or if we are far in excess of our requirements, which means we might be able to reallocate somewhere and make up some cost somewhere or improve cost by reducing the margins. I think margin optimization is something that can go on indefinitely, and I think there's a note about it in the best practice. You could meet this performance envelope by implementing both component B and component C in parallel, or by just putting component A in there. The options should come down to what makes sense from other factors such as cost or size in that case. And you could potentially optimize component A, redesign it to reduce the margin there. But you want to make sure that you're not overdoing it, right? If you're already at a 20% margin and someone says, well, we can cut that down and save 50 cents, if you're designing a $50,000 surgical robot, spending time and money reducing that margin further is not a great idea. That being said, if someone sees, different people have different ideas of what excess margin might mean. I might have an electrical engineer who thinks 100% margin is way too much. And I might have a quality person who says, this thing is life critical. I want at least 100% margin. And they may not talk to each other. So you may end up, So you may end up with someone going off and trying to optimize something down and creating a conflict of expectations there. So it's very important for systems engineers to set expectations on margins ahead of time so that people don't overdo it. So traceability, this is something that hits everybody, and I think it's probably one of the most universally feared processes by device designers, by design engineers. I don't think it needs to be the case, but I think that this comes from stakeholders who are outside the design process, who don't necessarily understand the design process, but they read an FDA guidance paper from 1999 and they think that it says a certain thing that it probably doesn't. And so they go to some crazy extent of defining 600 system requirements or 600 software requirements that get to extremely specific points of, I've seen crazy ones like requirements that define the name of a variable that shall be used as an intermediary variable and part of an algorithm. And that is so deep into the design implementation that it should never show up in the requirements. But it does sometimes, and sometimes the customers require that. And then you just have to work around it. But that does cause problems because the design engineers hate that. And so they tend to be concerned about this. In a lot of cases, having 600 software requirements is entirely unnecessary. Requirements should really be there to set the limits of the performance of the system and the expectations of the performance of the system, but not the actual specific implementation or performance of the system. Also, based on the size of the system, you can really pare down this process quite a bit. For example, this shows the orange arrow is the traceability, the idea that you trace through system requirements into the architecture, into the detailed design, into the implementation, into the test, and then back. And you trace back from your verification through the requirements, through that path. It's not always necessary. There's a lot of cases and a lot of companies prefer to trace across rather than down. You know, it would be extremely difficult to trace every line of code to an element in a design document and to an element in an architecture document to an element in a requirements document. It is necessary sometimes, and it's warranted with critical, essential performance type components, but it's not necessary in every situation. So technical reviews. So I'm a big fan of reviews. I think this is something that, again, design engineers seem to think is overbearing sometimes, but a review doesn't have to be, even a formal review to an FDA compliant process does not have to be daunting. The requirements are basically that you have to have someone who counts as an independent reviewer, and you have to take some notes and capture actions in writing. And then you'll have to document that the actions were completed. But all of that is just good practice. And if you're not capturing actions from a review, well, then you stand to miss them anyway, which is really a bad idea from a design engineering standpoint. I think an important part of technical reviews from a systems engineering standpoint is that you should have system reviews, you should have architecture reviews, those sorts of things, but you should also make sure that there is a systems engineer present at every technical review. Again, this comes to the point of a systems engineer being responsible for the product vision. If a systems engineer isn't there at the technical reviews, they're not going to be able to control that. I'm not suggesting that systems engineers must put their foot down in every technical review and force things to go one way or the other, particularly for smaller components. But I do think it's important that systems engineers attend so that they understand the implications on the higher levels of the system and how that propagates up to the very highest level of the system and ultimately the user needs. The best practice bullet here is one that we do at Sunrise, actually for a lot of things, not just design reviews, but in general, having checklists can be very helpful to set minimum expectations on what's done at, say, a design review. And it's useful not just at the design review, but also as a design aid, because the designer can say to themselves, can look at the checklist and say to themselves, what am I going to be asked about at this design review? And can specifically design to make sure that they catch all of the obvious bugs and they look at the pin assignments, things like that ahead of time, and make sure that they don't get caught on a very common, simple error. Configuration management is another one of those points, I think, that a lot of people are concerned about, but don't necessarily need to be. My suggestion is that people learn from software engineers who have done a fantastic job in the last decade or so with software systems and configuration management. I think they've been able to develop that very well because they have an easier time of releasing with the internet and pushed updates, so they can have a strategy of release often. But I think the lessons learned in terms of how to have a release process and how to define what your release means, what you're providing in the release, and what you're not, where you might be in excess of the performance or not quite reaching the performance expectations of the system, but still good enough to release. This happens a lot when there's interactions between product developers and outside elements, such as with user studies. You'll want to control what was used there, so you will usually go through a release process and document what's actually being used in that study. Another aspect of configuration management is change control. This is something that, it's a process that usually follows a standard process of reporting a change or a feature request, evaluating it, allocating it to an engineer, implementing it, the engineer implements it, reviewing the implementation, making sure that it meets the expectations, incorporating it, and then documenting as part of the release. As part of that process, there's always an approval authority, usually called a change control board. And I recommend, particularly when you're in a design project, and particularly an early design project, still have this process of change control, but keep it lean. Limit the change control board to one person, either the systems engineer or the project manager. And that way you don't have 13 stakeholders all with different ideas about what the change means and whether or not it's important to the project. Obviously, once you have a released product and changes are much more difficult to push, then you need to have additional stakeholders. You need representatives from the business and from the quality side in there. But in design, keep it lean. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up now, and I'd like to just make a couple points about what I hope you glean from this presentation. One, which is very near and dear to my heart, which is this point about systems engineering being an engineering discipline, not project management, and really more like other engineering disciplines. And to not be afraid to have different answers to what a systems engineer does, because we do lots of things. Again, I think I said it a few times, and I'd like to push again the idea that systems engineers are the ones responsible for the product vision. That may be the project manager on your project, but I think that really counts as a systems engineering task, and I think it's important to allocate it as such, particularly for very large projects where you have a team of systems engineers rather than a single systems engineer. And then, lastly, again, the FDA is expecting to see this more and more often, and medical devices are getting more and more complex. So you really ought to think about implementing a process. Having some of this documented, having some of these processes documented, creating these checklists, creating these templates, and defining where the system engineer fits into your process can really help to provide consistency in the output of your design efforts and improve them in general. It also helps you understand where to fit system engineers into the process, so you're not flying blind when you try to hire systems engineers. And with that, I think we'll take questions.
Thank you, Nick. I'd like to encourage folks on the line who have questions to use their toolboxes to pose these questions. We've got a couple that have come in already, and perhaps over the course of these two questions, maybe we can get others to bring in their questions and comments as well. So this first question is, how do you decide how to partition functions between implementation and software and electrical engineering?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, and it really has to be. It's really implementation dependent or system dependent, and not even just system dependent. It's design element dependent. The way to decide it is also going to be team dependent, and you have to evaluate your resources and your product needs. So you might have product needs that are business needs, like cost, and oftentimes solving problems in software is cheaper than in electronics. So as long as you can meet the other performance requirements of the system, you may opt to implement in software rather than in electrical. That being said, you always have to take into account your resources on the team in terms of what they can and can't implement. So you may have twice as many electrical engineers as software engineers on a team, and you may not have an option of increasing that. So you may say, I simply have more electrical engineering ability on the team, so I'm going to solve the problem electrically. That might take precedence over product costs because that could end up reducing design cost and schedule impact. So I guess there's no one hard and fast answer, and that's going to be true of basically any systems engineering design task. You need a good systems engineer to be able to understand those factors and weigh them against each other and make a decision. There's no process that's going to answer that question for you. Also, I guess in general, there's no process that will answer any design questions for you. You really still need good engineers to implement a design and to follow a design process. The design process is more about consistency and making sure that people are taking into account all of the thousands of things that you need to take into account in a design process.
Okay. Here's a question from an old friend that we haven't heard from for a while, but glad he's joined us. Can you talk a little bit about when the device may have a software requirement, like a tablet, wirelessly interfacing with the device, how to interact or team with the Smart App team that has a different process? And in
that's a really, really good question, and one that I've dealt with many, many times. There's many different ways you can deal with that. I would say the most important factor is to have someone assigned to the role of managing that, which is the systems engineer, because then it's their job to keep on top of it. Usually, the way I will try to address that is to very early on in what we'll call a phase one of the project, where we do inputs definition. We will try to collaborate with the other team designing the app, and we will, or conversely, if we're designing the app, the other team designing the device, and we will try to hammer out a good first pass at an interface. And then we'll put that interface into the requirements and or into whatever our input architecture documents are. And that way, there is something we've both agreed on early on in the process that we can both implement to at first. There will, of course, be iteration on that. There's iteration on everything, but it's good to have that first solid start. I hope that answers the question well for you.
Okay. Here's another one. In a situation where you have several candidates for a system engineering role, is there a reason to select one with some particular technical background over another? That is, software, electrical engineering, or mechanical engineering?
Yeah, I think it's good to have systems engineers with all of those backgrounds, but you can't expect to have one person with all of those backgrounds. Diversity is very helpful. In different people's experience, they've seen different people come out of different engineering disciplines into systems engineering. I've seen a lot of electrical engineers succeed as systems engineers. I know our director of mechanical engineering here, Doug Brown, is a great systems engineer and has seen many mechanical engineers succeed. I would say if you have the opportunity to hire more than one systems engineer and or to put them on the team, if you have a large enough project, I would say to diversify and have someone who is a systems engineer with a good electrical background team up with a systems engineer with a good mechanical background. There are lots of systems engineers with good software backgrounds. In fact, there are systems engineers who specialize in software and only have software backgrounds. It's great to have them on the team, but they often don't have as much depth on the physical device side. So it's important to have one of them as well.
How do you decide when to have one system engineer on a project or more than one, or when you have to have the PM act as the system, project manager act as the system engineer, or to have one of the electrical / mechanical other engineers act as the system engineer? Sorry about that.
That's all right. So that is discretionary, obviously. I think it's great to always have a dedicated systems engineer on the team, though that dedicated system engineer does not need to be 100% allocated to the team. At Sunrise, we often have project managers also act as a system engineer. I think that works out well at Sunrise because we specifically select for project managers with a strong systems background. In a lot of cases, in a lot of other companies I've seen and worked with, that is not the case. And I think it's very important to have someone who has that background. If you're a small team, if you're a startup and you don't have the funds to hire a dedicated systems engineer, then that's a situation where you might want to allocate, an electrical engineer or a mechanical engineer as the systems engineer. The important point there I would put out is that you should allocate you should specifically assign a person on the team to that role. Even if it's a very small project, assign someone that role so that someone is responsible for doing those things. Even if they're an electrical engineer and they don't understand the mechanical side of the design very well, if they are responsible for making sure that those decisions between allocating solutions to mechanical or electrical or software or electrical, then they will at least have some control over that, and someone will be looking at it on your project, and something is better than nothing.
All right. Well, Nick, thank you very, very much for the information that you've imparted this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate the help of your colleagues at Sunrise as well. Thanks again, Nick, and thanks to all of you who joined us. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tom.